Facsimile of early engraving. Born at Berlin in 1759, Humboldt's earliest studies were carried on under Camp, the well-known editor of many volumes of travels. Endowed with a great taste for botany, Humboldt made friends at the University of Göttingen with Forster the Younger, who had just made the tour of the world with Captain Cook. This friendship and the enthusiastic accounts given of his adventures by Forster probably did much to rouse in Humboldt a longing to travel. He took the lead in the study of geology, botany, chemistry, and animal magnetism, and to perfect himself in the various sciences, he visited England, Holland, Italy, and Switzerland. In 1797, after the death of his mother, who objected to his leaving Europe, he went to Paris, where he became acquainted with Aime Bomplin, a young botanist, with whom he at once agreed to go on several exploring expeditions. It had been arranged that Humboldt should accompany Captain Baudin, but the delay in the starting of his expedition exhausted the young enthusiast's patience, and he went to Marseille with the intention of joining the French army in Egypt. For 2 whole months he waited for the sailing of the frigate which was to take him, and, weary of inaction, he went to Spain with his friend Bomplind, in the hope of obtaining permission to visit the Spanish possessions in America. This was no easy matter, but Humboldt was a man of rare perseverance. He was thoroughly well informed, he had first-rate introductions, and he was, moreover, already becoming known. In spite, therefore, of the extreme reluctance of the government, he was at last authorized to explore the Spanish colonies and take any astronomical or geodesic observations he chose. The two friends left Corunna on the 5th June, 1799, and reached the Canaries 13 days later. Of course, as naturalists they were in duty bound not to land at Tenerife without ascending the peak. Scarcely any naturalist, says Humboldt in a letter to La Métairie, who, like myself, has passed through to the Indies, has had time to do more than go to the foot of this colossal volcano and admire the delightful gardens of Orotava. Fortunately for me, our frigate, the Pizarro, stopped for 6 days. I examined in detail the layers of which the Peak of Tade is composed. We slept in the moonlight at a height of 1,200 fathoms. At 2 o'clock in the morning, we started for the summit, where we arrived at 8 o'clock, in spite of the violent wind, the great heat of the ground, which burnt our boots, and the intense cold of the atmosphere. I will tell you nothing about the magnificent view, which included the volcanic islands of Lanzarote, Canaria, and Gomera at our feet. The desert, 20 leagues square, strewn with pumice stone and lava, and without insects or birds separating us from thickets of laurel trees and heaths, or of the vineyards studded with palms, banana, and dragon trees, the roots of which are washed by the waves. We went into the very crater itself. It is not more than 40 or 60 feet deep. The summit is 1904 fathoms above the sea level, as estimated by Borda in a very careful geometric measurement. The crater of the peak, that is to say, of the summit, has been inactive for several centuries, lava flowing from the sides only. The crater, however, provides an enormous quantity of sulfur and sulfate of iron. In July, Humboldt and Bomplind arrived at Cumana, in that part of America known as terra firma. Here they spent some weeks in examining the traces left by the great earthquake of 1797. They then determined the position of Cumana, which was placed a degree and a half too far north on all the maps, an error due to the fact of the current bearing to the north near La Trinidad, having deceived all travelers. In December 1799, Humboldt wrote from Caracas to the astronomer Lalande. I have just completed an intensely interesting journey in the interior of Peria, in the Cordillera of Cocollar, Tumari, and Guiri. I had 2 or 3 mules loaded with instruments, dried plants, and we penetrated to the Capuchin mission, which had never been visited by any naturalist. We discovered a great number of new plants, chiefly varieties of palms, and we are about to start for the Orinoco, and propose pushing on from it perhaps to San Carlos on the Rio Negro, beyond the equator. We have dried more than 1,600 plants and described more than 500 birds, picked up numberless shells and insects, and I have made some 50 drawings. I think that is pretty well in 4 months, considering the broiling heat of this zone. During this first trip, Humboldt visited the Chema and Garano missions. He also climbed to the summit of the Tumiraquiri and went down into the Guacharo cavern, the entrance to which, framed as it is with the most luxuriant vegetation, is truly magnificent. From it issues a considerable river, and its dim recesses echo to the gloomy notes of birds. It is the Acheron of the Chema Indians, for, according to their mythology and that of the natives of Orinoco, the souls of the dead go to this cavern. To go down into the Guacharo signifies in their language to die. The Indians go into the Guacharo cavern once a year, in the middle of summer, and destroy the greater number of the nests in it with long poles. At this time, many thousands of birds die of violent death, and the old inhabitants of the cave hover above the heads of the Indians with piercing cries, as if they would defend their broods. The young birds which fall to the ground are opened on the spot. Their peritoneum is covered with a thick layer of fat, extending from the abdomen to the anus and forming a kind of cushion between the legs. At the time called at Karip the oil harvest, the Indians build themselves huts of palm leaves outside the cavern, and then light fires of brushwood, over which they hang clay pots filled with the fat of the young birds recently killed. This fat, known under the name of the guacharo oil or butter, is half liquid, transparent, without smell, and so pure that it can be kept a year without turning rancid. Humboldt continues. We passed 15 days in the Carap Valley, situated at a height of 952 Castilian varas above the sea level, and inhabited by naked Indians. We saw some black monkeys with red beards. We had the satisfaction of being treated with the greatest kindness by the Capuchin monks and the missionaries living amongst these semi-barbarous people. Itinerary of Humboldt's Route in Equinoctial America. Engraved by Moriu. From the Carap Valley, the two travelers went back to Cumana by way of the Santa Maria Mountains and the Caduero Missions, and on the 21st November they arrived, having come by sea at Caracas, a town situated in the midst of a valley rich in cocoa, cotton, and coffee, yet with a European climate. Humboldt turned his stay at Caracas to account by studying the light of the stars of the southern hemisphere, for he had noticed that several, notably the altar, the feet of the centaur, and others, seemed to have changed since the time of La Caille. At the same time, he put his collections in order, dispatching part of them to Europe, and most thoroughly examined some rocks, with a view to ascertaining of what materials the earth's crust was here composed. After having explored the neighborhood of Caracas and ascended the Silla, which, although close to the town, had never been scaled by any native, Humboldt and Bomplund went to Valencia, along the shores of a lake called Tacarigua by the Indians, and exceeding in size that of Neufchatel in Switzerland. Nothing could give any idea of the richness and variety of the vegetation. But the interest of the lake consists not only in its picturesque and romantic beauty. The gradual decrease in the volume of its waters attracted the attention of Humboldt, who attributed it to the reckless cutting down of the forests in its neighborhood, resulting in the exhaustion of its sources. Near this lake Humboldt received proof of the truth of the accounts he had heard of an extraordinary tree, the palo de la veca, or cout tree, which yields a balsamic and very nutritive milk, drawn off from incisions made in the bark. The most arduous part of the trip began at Porto Caballo, at the entrance to the Llanos, or perfectly flat plains stretching between the hills of the coast and the Orinoco Valley. I am not sure, says Humboldt, that the first sight of the Llanos is not as surprising as that of the Andes. Nothing, in fact, could be more striking than the sea of grass, from which whirls of dust rise up continually, although not a breath of wind is felt at Calabozo, in the center of this vast plain. Humboldt first tested the power of the gymnotus, or electric eel, large numbers of which are met with in all the tributaries of the Orinoco. The Indians, who were afraid of exposing themselves to the electric discharge of these singular creatures, proposed sending some horses into the marsh containing them. The extraordinary noise made by the shoes of the horses, says Humboldt, made the eels come out of the ooze and prepare for battle. The yellowish livid gymnoti, resembling serpents, swam on the top of the water and squeezed themselves under the bodies of the quadrupeds which had disturbed them. The struggle which ensued between animals, so differently constituted, presented a very striking spectacle. The Indians, armed with harpoons and long canes, surrounded the pond on every side, and even climbed into the trees, the branches of which stretched horizontally over the water. Their wild cries, as they brandished their long sticks, prevented the horses from running away and getting back to the shores of the pond, whilst the eels, driven mad by the noise, defended themselves by repeated discharges from their electric batteries. For a long time they appeared victorious, and some horses succumbed to the violence of the repeated shocks which they received upon their vital organs from every side. They were stunned and sank beneath the water. Others, panting for breath with manes erect and wild eyes full of the keenest suffering, tried to fly from the scene, but the merciless Indians drove them back into the water. A very few, who succeeded in eluding the vigilance of the guards, regained the bank, stumbling at every step, and lay down upon the sand, exhausted with fatigue, every limb paralyzed from the electric shocks received from the eels. I never remember receiving a more terrible shock from a Leyden jar than I did from a gymnotus on which I accidentally trod just after it came out of the water. The astronomic position of Calabozo having been determined, Humboldt and Bomplund resumed their journey to the Orinoco. The Uriticu, with its numerous and ferocious crocodiles, and the Apure, one of the tributaries of the Orinoco, the banks of which are covered with a luxuriant vegetation such as is only met with in the tropics, were successively crossed or descended. The latter stream is flanked on either side by thick hedges, with openings here and there, through which boars, tigers, and other wild animals made their way to quench their thirst. When the shades of night shut in the forest, so silent by day, it resounds with the cries of birds and the howling or roaring of beasts of prey, vying with each other as to which shall make the most noise. While the Uriticu is inhabited by fierce crocodiles, the Apure is the home of a small fish called the carabido, which attacks bathers with great fury, often biting out large pieces of flesh. It is only 4 or 5 inches long, but more formidable than the largest crocodile, and the waters it frequents are carefully avoided by the Indians, in spite of their fondness for bathing and the relief it affords them, persecuted as they are by ants and mosquitoes. Our travelers went down the Orinoco as far as the Temi, which is connected by a short portage with the Cano Pimicino, a tributary of the Rio Negro. The banks of the Temi and the adjacent forests are often inundated, and then the Indians make waterways 2 or 3 feet wide between the trees. Nothing could be more quaint or imposing than floating amongst the gigantic growths, beneath their green foliage. Sometimes, 300 or 400 leagues inland, the traveler comes upon a troop of freshwater dolphins, spouting up water and compressed air in the manner which has gained for them the name of blowers. Gigantic vegetation on the banks of the Temi. Gigantic vegetation on the banks of the Temi. It took 4 days to transport the canoes from the Tenir to the Cano Pimicino, as a path had to be cleared with axes. The Pimicino flows into the Rio Negro, which is in its turn a tributary of the Amazon. Humboldt and Bomplund went down the Rio Negro as far as San Carlos, and then up the Cassiquairo, an important branch of the Orinoco, which connects it with the Rio Negro. The shores of the Cassiquairo are inhabited by the Idipaminores, who live entirely on smoked ants. Lastly, the travelers went up the Orinoco nearly to its source, at the foot of the Duida volcano, where their further progress was stopped by the hostility of the Guaharibos and the Guayca Indians, who were skillful marksmen with the bow and arrow. Here was discovered the famous El Dorado Lake, with its floating islets of talc. Thus was finally solved the problem of the junction of the Orinoco and the Maranon, which takes place on the borders of the Spanish and Portuguese territories, 2 degrees above the equator. The two travelers then floated with the current down the Orinoco, traversing by this means 500 leagues in 25 days, after which they halted for 3 weeks at Angostura to tide over the time of the great heat, when fever is prevalent, regaining Cumana in October, 1800. My health, says Humboldt, was proof against the fatigue of a journey of more than 1,300 leagues, but my poor comrade Bomplund was, immediately on his return, seized with fever and sickness, which nearly proved fatal. A constitution of exceptional vigor is necessary to enable a traveler to bear the fatigue, privations, and interruptions of every kind with which he has to contend in these unhealthy districts with impunity. We were constantly surrounded by voracious tigers and crocodiles, stung by venomous mosquitoes and ants, with no food for 3 months but water, bananas, fish, and tapioca, now crossing the territory of the earth-eating Ottomacs, now wandering through the desolate regions below the equator, where not a human creature is seen for 130 leagues. Few indeed are those who survive such perils and such exertions, fewer still are those who, having surmounted them, have sufficient courage and strength to encounter them a second time. We have seen what an important geographical discovery rewarded the perseverance of the explorers, who had completed the examination of the whole of the district north of the Amazon, between Papian and the mountains of French Guiana. The results obtained in other branches of science were no less novel and important. Humboldt had discovered that there exists amongst the Indians of the upper Orinoco and the Rio Negro a race with extremely fair complexions, differing entirely from the natives of the coast. He also noticed the curious tribe of the Ottomacs. These people, he says, who disfigure their bodies with hideous paintings, eat nothing but loam for some 3 months, when the height of the Orinoco cuts them off from the turtles which form their ordinary food. Some monks say they mix earth with the fat of crocodiles' tails, but this is a very false assertion. We saw provisions made of unadulterated earth, prepared only by slow roasting and moistening with water. Amongst the most curious of the discoveries made by Humboldt, we must mention that of the curare, the virulent poison which he saw manufactured by the Catarpne and Macquaridere Indians, and a specimen of which he sent to the Institute with the dapitch, a variety of Indian rubber hitherto unknown, being the gum which exudes spontaneously from the roots of the trees known as jacio and cucurma, and dries underground. Humboldt concluded his first journey by the exploration of the southern districts of San Domingo and Jamaica, and by a short stay in Cuba, where he and his companions made several experiments with a view to facilitating the making of sugar, surveyed the coast of the island, and took some astronomical observations. These occupations were interrupted by the news of the starting of Captain Baudin, who, it was said, was to double Cape Horn and examine the coasts of Chile and Peru. Humboldt, who had promised to join the expedition, at once left Cuba and crossed South America, arriving on the coast of Peru in time, as he thought, to receive the French navigator. Although Humboldt had throughout his long journey worked with a view to timing his arrival in the Peruvian capital to meet Baudin, it was only when he reached Quito that he ascertained that the new expedition was making for the Pacific by way of the Cape of Good Hope. In May 1801, Humboldt, still accompanied by the faithful Bonpland, embarked at Cartagena, whence he proposed going first to Santa Fe de Bogota and then to the lofty plains of Quito. To avoid the great heat, the travelers spent some time at the pretty village of Turbaco, situated on the heights overlooking the coast, where they made the necessary preparations for their journey. In one of their excursions in the neighborhood, they visited a very strange region, of which their Indian guides had often spoken under the name of Volcanitos. This is a volcanic district, set in a forest of palms, and of the tree called tola, about 2 miles to the east of Turbaco. According to a legend, the country was at one time one vast collection of burning mountains, but the fire was quenched by a saint, who merely poured a few drops of holy water upon it. In the center of an extensive plain Humboldt came upon some 20 cones of grayish clay, about 25 feet high, the mouths of which were full of water. As the travelers approached, a hollow sound was heard, succeeded in a few minutes by the escape of a great quantity of gas. According to the Indians, these phenomena had recurred for many years. Humboldt noticed that the gas which issues from these small volcanoes was a far purer azote than could then be obtained by chemical laboratories. Santa Fe is situated in a valley 8,600 feet above the sea level. Shut in on every side by lofty mountains, this valley appears to have been formerly a large lake. The Rio Bogota, which receives all the waters of the valley, has forced a passage for itself near the Tequendama farm, on the southwest of Santa Fe, beyond which it leaves the plain by a narrow channel and flows into the Magdalena Basin. As a natural consequence, were this passage blocked, the whole plain of Bogota would be inundated and the ancient lake restored. There exists amongst the Indians a legend similar to that connected with Roland's Pass in the Pyrenees, telling how one of their heroes split open the rocks and drained dry the valley of Bogota, after which, content with his exploit, he retired to the sacred town of Araca, where he did penance for 2,000 years, inflicting upon himself the greatest torture. The cataract of Tequendama, although not the largest in the world, yet affords a very beautiful sight. When swollen by the addition of all the waters of the valley, the river, a little above the falls, is 175 feet wide, but on entering the defile which appears to have been made by an earthquake, it is not more than 40 feet in breadth. The abyss into which it flings itself is no less than 600 feet deep. Above this vast precipice constantly rises a dense cloud of foam, which, falling again almost immediately, is said to contribute greatly to the fertility of the valley. Nothing could be more striking than the contrast between the valley of the Rio Bogota and that of the Magdalena, the one with the climate and productions of Europe, the corn, the oaks and other trees of our native land, the other with palms, sugar canes, and all the growths of the tropics. One of the most interesting of the natural curiosities met with by our travelers on the trip was the bridge of Jacanons, which they crossed in September 1801. At the bottom of one of the contracted ravines known as canyons, peculiar to the Andes, a little stream, the Rio Sumapaz, has forced for itself a narrow channel. To cross this river would be impossible, had not nature herself provided 2 bridges, one above the other, which are justly considered marvels of the country. 3 blocks of rock detached from one of the mountains by the earthquake which produced this mighty fissure have so fallen as to balance each other and form a natural arch, to which access is obtained by a path along the precipice. In the center of this bridge, there is an opening through which the traveler may gaze down into the infinite depth of the abyss, at the bottom of which rolls the torrent, its terrible roar mingled with the incessant screaming of thousands of birds. 60 feet above this bridge is a second, 50 feet long by 40 wide, and not more than 8 feet thick in the middle. To serve as a parapet, the natives have made a slender balustrade of reeds along the edges of this second bridge, from which the traveler can obtain a fine view of the magnificent scene beneath him. The heavy rain and bad roads made the journey to Quito very exhausting, but for all that Humboldt and Bonpland only halted there for an absolutely necessary rest, quickly pressing on for the Magdalena Valley and the magnificent forests clothing the sides of the Trinidiu in the central Andes. This mountain is considered one of the most difficult to cross in the whole chain. Even when the weather is favorable, 12 days at least are necessary for traversing the forests, in which not a human creature is seen and no food can be obtained. The highest point is 1,200 feet above the sea level, and the path leading up to it is in many parts only 1 foot wide. The traveler is generally carried, bound to a chair in a sitting posture, on the back of a native, as a porter carries a trunk. We preferred to go on foot, says Humboldt in a letter to his brother, and the weather being very fine, we were only 17 days in these solitudes, where not a trace is to be seen of any inhabitant. The night is passed in temporary huts made of the leaves of the heliconia, brought on purpose. On the western slopes of the Andes marshes have to be crossed, into which one sinks up to the knees, and the weather having changed when we reached them, it rained in torrents for the last few days. Our boots rotted on our feet, and we reached Carthago with naked and bleeding feet, but enriched with a fine collection of new plants. From Carthago, we went to Papian by way of Buga, crossing the fine Cauca Valley and skirting along the mountain of Choca, with the platina mines for which it is famous. We spent October 1801 at Papian, whence we made excursions to the basaltic mountains of Julusudo and the craters of the Pures volcano, which discharge hydrosulfuric steam and porphyritic granite with a terrible noise. The greatest difficulties were met with in going from Papian to Quito. We had to pass the Pasto Paramos, and that in the rainy season, which had now set in. A paramo in the Andes is a district some 1,700 or 2,000 fathoms high, where vegetation ceases and the cold is piercing. We went from Papian to Almager and thence to Pasto, at the foot of a terrible volcano, by way of the fearful precipices forming the ascent to the summit of the Cordillera, thus avoiding the heat of the Patia Valley, where one night will often bring on the fever known as the calentura de Patia, lasting 3 or 4 months. The province of Pasto consists entirely of a frozen plateau, almost too lofty for any vegetation to thrive on it, surrounded by volcanoes and sulfur mines, from which spiral columns of smoke are perpetually issuing. The inhabitants have no food but batatas, and when they run short they are obliged to live upon a little tree called a chupela, for which they have to contend with the bear of the Andes. After being wet through night and day for 2 months, and being all but drowned in a sudden flood, accompanied by an earthquake near the town of Jaybera, Humboldt and Bonpland arrived on the 6th January, 1801, at Quito, where they were received in cordial and princely style by the Marquis of Selva Leger. Quito is a fine town, but the intense cold and the barren mountains surrounding it make it a gloomy place to stay in. Since the great earthquake of the 4th February, 1797, the temperature has considerably decreased, and Bauger, who registered it at an average of 4 degrees to 16 degrees, would be surprised to find it varying 4 degrees to 10 degrees Reaumur. Cotopaxi and Pinchincha, Antisana and Ilanaza, the various craters of one subterranean fire, were all examined by the travelers, a fortnight being devoted to each. Humboldt twice reached the edge of the Pinchincha crater, never before seen except by Condaman. I made my first trip, he says, accompanied only by an Indian. Condaman had approached the crater by the lower part of its edge, which was covered with snow, and in this first attempt I followed his example. But we nearly perished. The Indian sank to the breast in a crevasse, and we found to our horror that we were walking on a bridge of frozen snow. For a little in advance of us, there were some holes through which we could see the light. Without knowing it, we were in fact on the vaults belonging to the crater itself. Startled but not discouraged, I changed my plan. From the outer rim of the crater, flung as it were upon the abyss, rise 3 peaks, 3 rocks, which are not covered with snow, because the steam from the volcano prevents the water from freezing. I climbed upon one of these rocks, and on the top of it, found a stone attached on one side only to the rock and undermined beneath, so as to protrude like a balcony over the precipice. This stone was but about 12 feet long by 6 broad, and is terribly shaken by the frequent earthquakes, of which we counted 18 in less than 30 minutes. To examine the depths of the crater thoroughly we lay on our faces, and I do not think imagination could conceive anything drearier, more gloomy, or more awful than what we saw. The crater consists of a circular hole nearly a league in circumference, the jagged edges of which are surrounded by snow. The interior is of pitchy blackness, but so vast is the gulf that the summits of several mountains situated in it can be made out at a depth of some 300 fathoms, so only fancy where their bases must be. I have no doubt that the bottom of the crater must be on a level with the town of Quito. Condamine found this volcano extinct and covered with snow, but we had to take the bad news to the inhabitants of the capital that the neighboring burning mountain is really active. Humboldt ascended the volcano of Antisana to a height of 2773 fathoms, but could go no further, as the cold was so intense that the blood started from the lips, eyes, and gums of the travelers. It was impossible to reach the crater of Cotopaxi. On the 9th June, 1802, Humboldt, accompanied by Bomplund, started from Quito to examine Chimborazo and Tungurunga. The peak of the latter fell in during the earthquake of 1797, and Humboldt found its height to be but 2531 fathoms, whilst in Condamine's time it was 2620 fathoms. From Quito, the travelers went to the Amazon by way of Lactacunga, Ambato, and Riobamba, situated in the province laid waste by the earthquake of 1797, when 40,000 inhabitants were swallowed up by water and mud. Going down the Andes, Humboldt and his companions had an opportunity of admiring the remains of the Yega Road, leading from Cusco to Asua, and known as the Incas Road. It was built entirely of hewn stones and was very straight. It might have been taken for one of the best Roman roads. In the same neighborhood are the ruins of a palace of the Inca Fupupengi, described by Condamine in the minutes of the Berlin Academy. After a stay of 10 days at Cuenca, Humboldt entered the province of Jaen, surveyed the Maranon as far as the Rio Napo, and with the aid of the astronomical observations he was able to make, supplemented Condamine's map. On the 23rd October, 1802, Humboldt entered Lima, where he successfully observed the transit of Mercury. After spending a month in that capital, he started for Guayaquil, whence he went by sea to Acapulco in Spanish America. The vast number of notes collected by Humboldt during the year he spent in Mexico, and which led to the publication of his essay on Spanish America, would, after what we have said of his previous proceedings, be enough to prove, if proof were needed, what a passion he had for knowledge, how indomitable was his energy, and how immense his power of work. At one and the same time, he was studying the antiquities and the history of Mexico, the character, customs, and language of its people, and taking observations in natural history, physical geography, chemistry, astronomy, and topography. The Tasco, Morin, and Guanajuato mines, which yield a profit of several million piastres per annum, first attracted the attention of Humboldt, who had early studied geology. He then examined the Jorullo volcano, which, although situated in the center of an immense plain 36 leagues from the sea, and more than 40 from any volcano, discharged earth on the 29th September, 1759, and formed a mountain of cinders and clay 1,700 feet high. In Mexico, the travelers were able to obtain everything necessary to the arrangement of the immense collections they had accumulated, to classify and compare the observations each had taken, and to prepare their geographical map for publication. Finally, in January 1804, they left Acapulco to examine the eastern slopes of the Cordilleras and to take the dimensions of the two lofty Puebla volcanoes. Popocatépetl, says Disparo Cooley, is always active, although nothing but smoke and ashes have issued from its crater for centuries. It is not only 2,000 feet higher than the loftiest mountains of Europe, but is also the loftiest mountain in Spanish America. In spite of the great quantity of snow which had recently fallen, Humboldt accomplished the ascent of the Coffer, 1,300 feet higher than the peak of Tenerife, obtaining from its summit an extensive and varied view, embracing the Puebla Plain and the eastern slopes of the Mexican Cordilleras, clothed with thick forests of liquid amber, tree ferns, and sensitive plants. The travelers were able to make out the port of Vera Cruz, the castle of San Juan de Loa, and the seashore. This mountain owes its name of Coffer to a naked rock of pyramidal form, which rises like a tower from its summit at a height of 500 feet. After this last trip, Humboldt went down to Vera Cruz, and having fortunately escaped the yellow fever then decimating the population, he set sail for Cuba, where he had left the greater part of his collection, going thence to Philadelphia. There he remained a few weeks to make a cursory study of the political constitution of the United States, returning to Europe in August 1804. The results of Humboldt's travels were such that he may be justly called the discoverer of equinoctial America, which before his time had been explored without becoming really known, while many of its innumerable riches were absolutely ignored. It must be fully acknowledged that no traveler ever before did so much as Humboldt for physical geography and its kindred sciences. He was the very ideal of a traveler, and the world is indebted to him for important generalizations concerning magnetism and climate, whose results are plainly seen in the isothermal lines of modern maps. The writings of Humboldt mark an era in the science of geography and have led to many further researches. End of the great navigators of the 18th century.